She served him every day, a familiar face bending over the same table until one handwritten note on a receipt altered everything. Subscribe now because this is a story about power, secrecy, and what happens when a single scrap of paper becomes truth. The restaurant smelled of lemon oil and fry garlic. The linen napkins folded like small white boats, and the VIP table sat under a chandelier that threw fractured gold across a floor that never remembered anyone who had hurt there. Lena Morales smoothed her apron for the third time that night, her palms knowing the texture of wood and porcelain better than the texture of safety. She was careful by habit and invisible by design. She would not have imagined that a folded receipt with 3 words and a crooked signature would pull apart a life she had learned to make small. Tonight, a man at table 12, Marcus Hale, CEO of Hale Innovations, lifted his glass and blinked toward her. The moment was ordinary and then impossible. A customer had left a note that said, "Meet me outside," and the signature was not his. If someone looked closer, secrets that had been buried under degrees, patents, and polished glass would begin to breathe again. If Marcus saw what the note implied, everything Lena had tried to keep quiet could vanish. Stay with this till the end, because the next hour of her life would be the start of a decade of reckoning. Lena had been working at Levanter, a marble-floored dining room known for discreet power lunches, for 2 years. She learned the patterns of the clientele the way some people learned national capitals. Marcus Hale always ordered the same 2 starters, always asked for extra ice in his water, and never let the tips be split. He spoke with a voice that made heads incline the way oak makes way for wind. Lena set plates and listened more than she spoke, a strategy honed after years of being mistaken for less than her ambitions. Her manager, Sarah Kim, kept a close ledger of complaints and bonuses. Chef Daniel Cho tasted sauces and lived in the kitchen where stories hardened into routine. Priya Singh at the espresso bar kept Lena company with small jokes and a willingness to hide a spare sandwich in a pocket. Tom Reyes, the night janitor, had an eye for misplaced receipts. Rachel Adler at the Tribune had called once about a minor theft at a local gallery, and Lena had rebuffed the call, not for fear, but because certain doors hurt to open. Andrew Cole, a lawyer Lena had never met until later, would come to matter. Maya Bennett, an investor with a reputation for contrite late phone calls, and Judge Elaine Porter would be names that mattered at the end. In the week that followed the note, these names braided into Lena's days like rope being tested for strain. On the night the note appeared, there were 5 senses at work in the dining room. The clink of cutlery made a steady metronome. The murmur of a dozen conversations fed into the hush. Lemon oil left a faint promise on fingertips. The cloth of Lena's apron rubbed against her hips with every turn, and the bitter sweetness of espresso lingered on her tongue after she refilled Marcus Hale's cup for the 3rd time. She took his card, wrote the total by habit, and then something slackened in her chest when Tom pointed to the curled paper. The ink blotched where a thumb had stayed too long. She unfolded it in the back alley under Sodium City lights and read 3 words that did not belong on a receipt. "Meet me." Beneath it, a signature she recognized not as a flourish, but as a history. The paper smelt faintly of cigarette smoke and the restaurant's cleaning solvent, a combination that would later be important to prove where it had been handled. She folded it back and placed it in her apron as if it were a seed. 2 brief dialogues marked the first days after the note. In one, Sarah asked softly what was wrong. Lena said, "I am fine," and the words were the shape of a lie. Sarah tilted her head and said, "You can tell me," and Lena said, "I will tell you when I can." In the other, Priya said, "Lena, you should go home and sleep," and Lena said, "I will when there is nothing left to fix." Those exchanges held 4 to 5 sensory notes each: a hand brushing an arm, coffee steam, the coarse wool of a jacket, the metallic click of a key, the distant siren down the avenue. They mapped relationships and pressures so that when Marcus looked at Lena over his rim of water, the social geography of class and quiet was already in place. Then came an inciting incident that forced other people into the room. An older man at table 9 recognized the handwriting on the receipt and asked aloud. The question cut the dining room as if someone had opened a window and let in wind. Marcus looked up, a small tightening at his jaw, and asked Lena where she was from. She answered with a rehearsed line that sounded like a passport stamp where none existed. The man, whose name was Richard Holloway, said that the signature was the same as a document he had seen years ago when he did pro bono work for a university. The murmur swelled. Lena felt her face warm. A waiter spilling wine dropped the glass and the sound became an accusation. That night, a photograph on a phone, a scrap of metadata, and a pointed text message began to rewrite Lena's assumed past into something investigatable. Lena's reaction was not sudden. She lived a life of small refusals and careful agreements. When the possibility that someone could connect her to a research paper disappeared, she considered retreat. But retreat had never worked for a woman who had once written code at 3 in the morning so a thesis could stand without acknowledgement. In the privacy of her studio apartment, she let memory come like a tide. The backstory she had kept in the dark was a life of scholarships and stolen credits. As a student, she had worked at a lab where she helped prototype a sensor that measured microvolt shifts across neural networks. Professors praised her and then filed patents without her name. Colleagues took corners of code she wrote, and administrative noise erased her contributions. She had left the program the week her advisor, Dr. Alan Rivers, submitted a paper listing only the core team and a single lead author who was not her. The hurt had been technical and intimate. She could quote algorithms, and yet she could not explain why a series of emails disappeared from her account when she tried to prove authorship. She had documents backed up in a hard drive that vanished in a moving day, the same year the patent was filed. For years, she had answered to other people's versions of her work and learned to survive in roles that asked nothing of her mind and everything of her hands. Her backstory had voice lines of late-night coding, the metallic taste of energy drink, the sensation of being in rooms where names passed like currency, and hers was never exchanged. She had reasons to hide. She had reasons to avoid courtroom stages where someone would ask, "Where were you when your name was stolen?" She had a life of resilience tempered into small survival strategies, the kind that made her excellent at service jobs because service work rewarded discretion and endurance. While Lena's personal story unfolded, she found an ally she had not expected. Rachel Adler, the journalist from the Tribune who had once called about a theft, stopped by Levanter and asked questions that were not small. Rachel was generous with connections and suspicious of polished narratives. Andrew Cole, a litigation attorney whose reputation for methodical case building had made him unpopular at corporate cocktail parties, offered a free consultation after Rachel made a private call. Maya Bennett, who had been an investor in a startup that later accused Marcus of appropriation, texted a single line offering bank records she was willing to release. These people were not spectators. They were tools that Lena learned to use. Each time she sat with someone at a table to explain a fragment, there were sensory elements to ground the memories. Marcus's office smelled of cedar and ozone. His secretary Elise typed with a calm efficiency that made Lena anxious, and the elevator played a recorded melody that meant the world above was always calm. The early investigation pushed Lena into technical rooms she had avoided emotionally. She and Andrew verified timestamps on old files, compared metadata, and looked for anomalies in servers. A brief technical explanation matters here. Forensic metadata analysis meant extracting creation and modification timestamps embedded in documents, comparing SHA-256 checksums of files to confirm integrity, and using server logs to trace IP addresses and access patterns. Chain of custody was established by sealing drives in tamper-evident bags and documenting every transfer on a ledger to ensure evidence would be admissible. Depositions would be scheduled, subpoenas prepared, and due diligence conducted on corporate records to match signatures and filing dates. This process could take months and required careful alignment of technical proof and legal timelines. The team knew that one misplaced timestamp could undo months of work and that paperwork had to be flawless. Discovery opened doors. An IT contractor named Leo Martinez was remembered by Daniel as the man who had once backed up lab files to a personal device when servers went down. Leo said he had been paid under the table and had copies. His apartment smelled of fried rice and old printer ink, and he rubbed the bridge of his nose when Lena showed him a photograph she had found on a phone of a whiteboard full of equations she had once scrawled. Leo said he still had an old drive, and for a price he would check it. In a tense exchange that lasted 9 minutes, Leo insisted he had no attachment to corporate life, and Lena said, "We are not here to punish," and Leo said, "Then give me something that makes it worth staying awake for." The negotiation had edges of barter and trust. Meanwhile, Rachel followed paper trails through library archives where Dr. Alan Rivers, Lena's one-time advisor, had left marginal notes that referenced an experiment Lena had spearheaded. Rivers was evasive in an interview, but a voicemail leaked where he said, "I should have credited her," and then laughed, and then the laugh was gone. That voicemail became a small revelation. The chain that connected a missing name to published patents was getting visible. There were moments of intense tension that pushed the narrative forward. One such peak happened when a sealed envelope arrived at Levanter containing a photocopy of a patent application with Lena's handwriting in the margins. The restaurant smelled of basil and hot butter that night, and Lena's hands did not stop shaking for an hour. She and Rachel read the margins aloud in whispers and felt the weight of years in each penciled note. The photocopy proved that someone had kept her annotations without credit. Lena put the page under a lamp and watched the light reveal details the photocopy had obscured. The second peek took place in a deposition room where Marcus sat across from Lena and the air smelled of too much air conditioning and lemon cleaner. Their exchange was long and layered, with 2 lawyers present. Marcus said, "I do not recall that name," and Lena said, "It is in your handwriting on a page you signed." Marcus blinked and said, "My signature looks like that on many pages, and..." Lena said, "Do you not remember the lab in Boston in 2013? And Marcus said, "That is a different matter entirely." The dialogue stretched for 14 exchanges, each line a test of stamina. The lawyer next to Marcus whispered a correction, and Marcus narrowed his eyes. Lena felt like a small boat in a canal, and the current was legal muscle. The third peak was a late-night meeting in a parking garage between Lena and Maya Bennett. Maya smelled of citrus perfume and high-end coffee, and she slid a thumb drive across to Lena with bank statements showing payments from Marcus's company to a consulting firm with a name that matched an alias used in filings. Lena looked at the numbers, felt the roughness of paper, and for the first time in years allowed herself a full inhale of hope. Each peak had sensory anchors and consequences that made the stakes feel tactile and immediate. Naming actors in the periphery mattered. Elise, the secretary, misfiled invoices and later admitted she had thrown away a folder that might have contained earlier drafts. Tom, the janitor, found a forgotten box in a coat closet that later became critical evidence. Daniel, the chef, asked for Lena's version when a private dinner party required a story and became an informal witness to her character. Rachel, the journalist, kept a folder with every call log she had placed to university administrators. Andrew, the lawyer, dug into incorporation documents. Priya, the barista, hid Lena a flash drive and a sack of coffee beans for a day to keep it from being confiscated. Judge Elaine Porter would later have the capacity to shape outcomes through decorum and legal rulings. Each of these people did things that were small in appearance and decisive in effect. Their names appeared in affidavits, and their memories were recorded under oath. That legal architecture, the sequence of sworn statements, testimonies, and documentary evidence, created a scaffolding for the case. The discovery phase produced a crucial document that connected Marcus to a merger he had claimed to be peripheral to. A contract with a signature line that matched the handwriting on the receipt had been filed the same month a patent application was amended to exclude Lena. The proof came not only from a signature comparison, but from auditors who traced transaction flows through back accounts and shell companies. An auditor named Victor Singh ran ledgers and found a series of payments that moved from Hale Innovations to a consulting shell and then to a patent firm in Delaware. Victor smelled of stale coffee and wore a jacket that had borne many late nights. He explained the audit process in precise terms. Transactions were traced by matching bank reference numbers, reconciling monthly statements across accounts, and isolating anomalies like round number transfers and narrative-free field entries that hinted at disguised consulting fees. The evidence of payment made questions about intent harder to dismiss. The corporate face Marcus wore cracked. The confrontation scene that followed was long and exhaustive. In a conference room with glass that looked out over the city, Lena sat with Andrew and Rachel, and Marcus sat with his counsel and a woman named Vanessa Park, who was listed as Chief Compliance Officer. The room hummed with air conditioning. Lena began. Lena said, "I was on that project from day one, and I have emails that show my commits." Marcus said, "We had a broader team, and there are many contributors." Lena said, "The commits are time-stamped, and the repository shows my username on the initial build." And Marcus said, "Our legal filings list who owned the intellectual property." And Lena said, "You filed amendments after we left and removed contributors." Vanessa said, "You cannot accuse without proof." And Lena said, "The proof is here on this drive." And then Andrew said, "We have a chain of custody, and we will demonstrate it." Marcus leaned forward and said, "You are making very serious allegations." And Lena said, "I am stating facts." Marcus asked, "Where did you get this drive?" And Lena said, "It was left in a coat closet and Tom saw it." And then Elise said, "I must have misfiled." And Lena said, "Then it existed within your control." Marcus's counsel attempted to deflect and asked about motive, and Lena said, "My motive is simple, my name." Vanessa tried to slide a contract packet across the table and said, "Settlement is a possibility." And Lena said, "I will not trade my name for money." And Marcus said, "You know how lawsuits drain people." And Lena said, "I know how silence drains people more." The exchange ran through 12 to 13 verbal turns with interjections from lawyers. And each time the sensory landscape shifted, a shuffle of paper, the scrape of a pen, the soft thud of a gavel. Image when Judge Porter's name came up. The subtext in each line carried the weight of agency and denial. At one point, Marcus's voice had a brittle edge that gave away annoyance and then fatigue, a human register under the corporate mask. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction tightened like a band. Opinion pieces debated the likelihood of a private citizen winning against a titan. Social media turned Lena into a shorthand for the invisible labor of technical women. Comments ranged from solidarity to suspicion. The newsroom where Rachel worked set up a timeline and published redacted copies of documents that suggested an uneven record. The firm that had handled the original patent filings conducted an internal audit. A press conference announced that Hale Innovations would cooperate. The stock dipped temporarily and then recovered, but Lena watched as reputations were tested in ways that had nothing to do with legal outcomes. People in her neighborhood, including a neighbor named Rosa who ran a bodega and had once lent Lena money, started to whisper less and ask more. Her ability to remain anonymous disintegrated. Her sense of small survival gave way to a strange publicness. The procedural part of the case required crisp paperwork. Depositions were scheduled within legal timelines, subpoenas were served on third-party firms, and forensic images of hard drives were created to preserve data at precise timestamps. Legal counsel explained that due diligence required verification of chain of title, comparison of patent filing dates, and an audit trail that bridged emails, commit logs, and transaction histories. They described how the Patent Office would consider priority dates and how amendments could be challenged by providing earlier dated material as proof. These procedural steps were recorded in an affidavit and filed. The lawyers emphasized that a successful challenge would hinge on matching content and timing, not merely on moral claims. Those procedural notes were later condensed into exhibits and tied to witness testimonies. A turning point arrived when an old server backup was unearthed at a storage facility in New Jersey where Dr. Rivers had outsourced archival files. A technician named Omar opened a crate and found a set of drives in a labeled box. The drive smelled of dust and industrial tape, and when the tech ran recovery software, he uncovered files with Lena's commits. Metadata showed creation dates that predated the patent filings. The server logs placed access from an IP associated with a lab machine on campus on June 12, 2013. These technical proofs were the kind investigators and lawyers had sought, and they validated Lena's memory in a way that made repudiation difficult. Marcus's legal team scrambled to explain chain of custody concerns and attempted to question whether the drives had been tampered with. Andrew filed affidavits and ordered independent hash comparisons to demonstrate the integrity of the files. The hashes matched across multiple copies, and the narrative that had been in Marcus's favor began to wobble. The trial was not a single dramatic day, but a sequence of hearings, filings, and small courtroom triumphs. Witnesses, including Elise, Tom, and Leo, testified about misfiled papers and hidden drives. Victor explained ledger discrepancies, and Maya attested to conversations about consulting arrangements. Judges and clerks moved the process with an attention to precedent and docket. Lena sat under lights that smelled faintly of antiseptic and listened while lawyers used phrases like burden of proof and preponderance. The moment when Marcus had to account for a draft of the patent in his handwriting was slow and atmospheric. Elena Porter presided with a face that suggested caution and the capacity to read both law and human dynamics. The jury, if constituted, would be asked to weigh documents that were technical and the testimonies that were human. The legal architecture required clarity, and the community awaited a result that felt like justice. There were 5 scenes of high tension across the trial. The first involved the envelope with the photocopy and the immediate fear that someone could fabricate evidence. Lena felt the photocopy like a cold stone in her palm, and the forensic team had to confirm toner distribution. The second was the deposition, where Marcus denied knowledge and Lena presented time-stamped logs. That back and forth left both parties exhausted, and it changed the tone of negotiations. The third was the parking garage exchange with Maya, where bank records showed a pattern of payments. The fourth was the unearthing of the server drives that matched Lena's commits and forced a reorientation of the narrative. The fifth was the moment in the courtroom when Marcus's counsel objected to a line of questioning, and Judge Porter overruled with a searing rationale that placed document probity over corporate convenience. Each moment carried sensory detail that made the scenes feel immediate, like the cold of the metal table, the buzz of overhead fluorescence, the smell of coffee, the rustle of paper, and the taste of saliva caught in a throat before speaking. Midway through the narrative, there was a call to action for viewers and a direct invitation to engage. If you were in her place, what would you do? Take a breath. We know it is easy to judge from the outside, but these moments force choices that are rarely simple. Write in the comments, starting with "in my place," and tell us whether you would fight publicly, negotiate quietly, or walk away. Share details if you can, because the most thoughtful answers will be highlighted in upcoming videos. Your response could help someone who needs a plan or comfort, and this community has a track record of sharing resources from legal aid organizations, advocacy groups, and mental health support. If you are an attorney or an expert with experience in intellectual property, please add those credentials so others may reach out for help. Thank you for taking a moment to reflect. Now we return to how one receipt sparked an investigation that would touch institutions and people in unexpected ways. As proceedings advanced, an unexpected romance formed in the margins. Andrew and Lena found themselves meeting not as litigant and counsel, but as people who had survived long nights of strategy and fear. He would call with questions and stay on the line until she had dinner on the table, his voice a steady presence that made the hours seem less heavy. There were sensual notes in simple things: the warmth of his coffee cup handed across a conference table, the smell of his coat, the touch of his hand when he guided papers into place. It was not a plot device, and it became complicated. Lena resisted the instinct to let affection replace the work she had to do, but over time, trust grew. He admired her technical mind, and she began to see him as someone who would not vanish when the cameras left. This emergent partnership symbolized a form of partnership beyond the legal, the reconstruction of identity with someone who saw both her work and her wounds. In the legal resolution, offers of settlement arrived when Marcus's board grew anxious about reputational costs. Vanessa Park proposed a settlement that included a payment and a non-disclosure agreement. Lena refused a non-disclosure and instead sought a corrected patent registration that acknowledged her contribution and a financial remedy that reflected lost opportunity. The negotiation was tense and included 16 rounds of offer and counteroffer. In boardroom air that tasted like stale breath and recycled air, Lena insisted on public acknowledgement. Marcus's team argued that public apology would damage investors and stock. Eventually, the settlement included a recorded amendment to the patent, a payment into a trust for Lena, and a public statement that clarified authorship. Marcus issued a statement that acknowledged errors and promised reforms in documentation and compliance. To some, it looked like a victory that cost both sides. To others, it looked like a compromise that still left scars. The aftermath required structural change. Hale Innovations adopted new policies requiring detailed contributor logs, mandatory commit records with two-factor authentication, and a compliance review process for patent filings. The firm introduced an audit trail for intellectual property that included mandatory retention of lab notebooks, encrypted backups, and regular third-party audits. These procedural changes were described in memos that became case exhibits and later industry references. The technical side mattered. The company committed to due diligence steps that included timestamp verification, server mirroring, and auditable authentication for signature approvals. The public reaction varied from celebration to skepticism. Lena was given credit on a corrected patent and a small advisory position to ensure compliance frameworks were practical, not performative. 1 month later, Lena was measured by relief and exhaustion. She had a small plaque in a local university library where one of her early notes was cataloged. She slept more, and her hands unlearned some of their tremors. The neighborhood that had watched her quietly applauded in small ways. Rosa brought empanadas, and Tom raised a hand in respect. Lena received calls from students who had been in similar positions, and she began to mentor. She also navigated the logistic reality of the settlement and the new role it demanded. She learned to assert boundaries with journalists and found solace in trivial routines like watering a fern by her window. The city kept moving, and Lena let herself attend to small pleasures. In private, she and Andrew walked through a park and discussed plans for public talks about academic credit. 3 months later, the legal cleanup had created a ripple across academic labs in the region. Universities revised authorship policies, journals asked for detailed contribution statements, and the Patent Office published guidance about metadata as evidence. Lena was invited to a symposium where she explained the practical steps engineers could take to protect work. She had a moment at a podium where the lights felt too bright, and she recognized that public speaking was now part of the life she had once avoided. She felt a complicated joy when students approached her to say they had used her template for commit logs. Lena also begun to think seriously about launching a small consultancy to help labs and startups build ethical documentation practices. The offer felt like a way to turn personal pain into systemic repair. 6 months later, Lena had begun that consultancy. She moved from serving plates to leading workshops on data integrity, a transition that felt natural because her knowledge came from the place where theory and practice met. Her company was small and did not have investors at first. She worked with community colleges, small research labs, and independent engineers to create systems that recorded contribution and preserved chain of custody. Her name appeared on a list of corrected patents in official records, and she received a quiet invitation to speak at a legal clinic about intellectual property rights. Her relationship with Andrew had moved from cautious dinners to planning a winter weekend with his parents. The city she lived in had small changes too. Levanter issued a public apology to staff about mishandled evidence and instituted training for managers about privacy and documentation. There was still anger and unfinished conversations, but there was movement. The epilogue did not erase the years of being overlooked, but it created a new map where Lena could place markers of achievement and protection. In the end, Lena did not simply recover a line on a page, she recovered a narrative of self that had been edited out of official files. The man who had once signed off on drafts had to attend to the public consequences of inattention. Marcus Hale faced a corporate review and reputational losses that adjusted how he navigated public spaces. Her victory was part legal and part social and part personal. She built a business that helped others avoid the erasure she knew intimately. She also found someone who wanted to be present when she told old stories and did not try to drown them in grand gestures. If this story speaks to you and you care about fairness in workplaces or academia, subscribe and join a community that supports those who seek to put their names on the work they did. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that small papers can carry heavy truths and that justice sometimes arrives as a slow, collected effort of ordinary people. Remember that a single note on a receipt changed a life, and that lives are worth fighting for.